All right. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for being here. Well, today we're going to talk about DevOps. Well, DevSecOps, DevOps meets Sec, your journey to deliver secure code fast. This is a presentation that I made based on my personal experience and what I see in the industry while implementing DevSecOps programs across different companies. Just a quick introduction about me. Well, I'm Davide Cioccia, as Mark introduced me. I'm Senior Application Security Architect at Veralto, but I'm also part of the security community. So I'm DevSecOps chapter lead for the Netherlands, where we organize webinar events all around DevSecOps. I'm a speaker and trainer at different conferences. You might know them, DEF CON, the OWASP Subsec, or Black Hat. And I changed different roles in my career. I started as a pen tester, then I became a security engineer. So I switched from the offensive to the defensive side. And now I'm holding the position of security architect, so overseeing the big picture. And on the fun side, I'm a tennis and padel player, an addicted one, actually. So when did we first start talking more and more about DevOps? Right? Based on this graph, we can see that happened in 2012, 2013. But actually, the DevOps Manifesto was first published between 2007 and 2008. And we can see that something starts moving around these years and keeps growing linearly, right? And I really wish these were my investments, but they're not, unfortunately. DevSecOps instead seems to be mentioned quite a lot around 2004, and no idea why, because DevOps didn't exist back then. But if we normalize the graph, we can assume that the term DevSecOps started getting the right attention only after 2016 and 2017. And that's almost a 10 years gap, right? But it shows also a very big growth in the last 5 years. I would say better later than never. Now, if we put these two graphs together, right, I think we can all observe a minute of silence for DevSecOps, right? So the fame that DevOps has is not even comparable with the popularity of DevSecOps. But I'm pretty sure we will get there, right? And this is to say that security is still a step behind development. So as I said before, today I want to share with you some of the failures and successes that I personally encounter in my day-to-day job as application security architect. And I hope to give you a good understanding of what to do and what not to do when implementing DevOps or DevSecOps. And I would like to leave also some food for thoughts for you later. So you start designing your DevOps cycle, right? And figure out the best tools and solution to make this happen. So you choose your version control, right? GitHub to Bitbucket, to name a few. You need to deploy your code in cloud, for example, in AWS, Google Cloud, Azure. You start using infrastructure as code, to name a few technologies like Terraform, AWS CDK. You use virtualization because you want your product to be scalable, right? You use Docker or Kubernetes. But you also start setting up the continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline, right? The CI/CD. Because you want to automate most of the process to bring your product from a concept, from code to production. So what happens in many companies is that many teams have the ability and the power, the freedom to choose their own tools, right? So let's say you give this freedom to the teams. One day you go on holiday, 3 weeks, 1 month, 2 months. When you return, this is what you see, right? Hundreds of interconnected tools, actions, runners, scripts that have been defined by the development teams, and they all work perfectly together. So development is going at speed of light until the security person is hired, and it's time to include security in your software development lifecycle, in your DevOps process. But before we start going into what I think works and what doesn't when implementing DevSecOps, I want to highlight some benefits of DevOps. Well, for sure, using DevOps, I mean that you can be faster, better in product delivery. because you can ship new feature faster to your customers, right? You can get feedback faster, but that means also faster issue resolution and also reduce complexity, okay? You can have greater scalability and availability because you can scale your product across multiple infrastructures, right? In cloud, for example, or using Dockers or Kubernetes. You have better resource utilization, and you have greater visibility into system outcomes and also system monitorings. And this whole means that there is a greater innovation. But in this list, there is one big pro missing. And this pro actually is the word sec in DevOps, right? Because having security as part of DevOps means also having greater, faster, and cheaper security. And we will see why in the presentation, because but for now, I want to share with you what GitLab did in the 2023. So GitLab asked 5,000 people, mixed between development and security, what are the biggest challenges in software development in 2023? Right. This research is from March 2023, so we expect a new one soon. And many people said security. Actually, the quote that you see on screen is very interesting. It says, "We owe humanity. We owe security to humanity," and it's pretty cool. But at the same time, we still need to deal with the same frustration that we had in the previous years, right? When it comes to security. So many people said that testing happens too late in the software development lifecycle. It is difficult to prioritize vulnerabilities remediation, or there are too many false positives. I think many of you can recognize these issues in your day-to-day work. It is difficult to track vulnerability status, right? Because we have different tools with different indicators, different issues. And it is difficult, still difficult to understand the vulnerability findings, right? And last but not least, testing is not sufficiently frequent or consistent. So my question for you is DevSecOps ever going to match the success of DevOps? Well, I am optimistic, so I would say yes. And maybe we'll not even talk about DevSecOps anymore. We'll talk about DevOps only, because the word sec will be embedded in the word dev. Now, one of the quotes that I really like is this one from Product Squad, although it's from 2020, but very actual. And it says that what I love about DevOps is that in the end, it's all about people. But I want to make one small correction to this quote and say that what I love about DevOps, in the end, it's all about culture. And that's because culture in the company stays. People might change, might rotate, new people might come in, but the culture must be the same when it comes to implementing DevSecOps, right? But you might say, okay, what do you mean with culture? What is culture? And during the presentation, I will give you two examples to understand better what security culture means in DevSecOps. One bad example, one good example. One example of bad security culture, one example of good security culture. And I would like you to think also, how does the security culture look like in your company? Okay. So, as I said, this one is for me an example, or many examples of poor security culture. For example, we have poor security culture in a company when there is one security person for 1,000 developers, right? Or the security department is the only department that owns the security of the product. That's wrong. Or the fact that security approves every change before going to production, right? And we will see later why this is an issue. Or if you only rely on compliance pen test done once a year, right? That's not the way of securing continuously your product. And again, last but not least, management is not engaged in security discussions, right? That doesn't work. There is no one message about security throughout the company in that case. What I think instead is a strong security culture is when security and development work together to provide the best risk evaluation of issues, vulnerabilities, new tools, security improvements, right? Or possible short-term and long-term remediation. But in order to do that, we need to bring in security people with development background. They need to understand the product, to understand how development people or development departments work, right? We need to let security work together with the development team. And the development team teams must own the security of their product, right? You see the difference between the two cultures, right? But in the first one, the poor one, the security team owns the security of the product. In a strong security culture, it's the development team that owns the security of the product. The security team will be there as a consultant, right, to improve and to consult the development team about remediation, improvement in security. And of course, management speaks regularly about security. Now, during this presentation, we'll go through 9 pitfalls that I identified in my career based on my experience. And the number one pitfall that I see is that, when implementing DevSecOps or DevOps, is that security is not part of development. Okay. So if we lay down the infinite DevOps cycle that we saw in the previous slides, one of the pitfalls that we often see is that security is an afterthought, right? The only security that is done when code is already released in production, and is done by a pen test or a vulnerability scanning. And that does not work. And I will tell you why. Well, for 3 reasons. Because this approach focuses on bugs and not flaws. We cannot discover complex logic flaws that could be found during the design phase, for example, right? And these flaws are very expensive to remediate. It is very expensive because, let's say, the pen test is amazing, right? It finds an enormous amount of flaws that we didn't know about. But now what happens is that developers will need to go back to the old code and trying to fix it, right? Maybe change the design and retest everything. So they need to go to testing, QA, and again, release to production. And this will take weeks. And the third reason why this is a pitfall is that the coverage will be defined by whom will do the pen test, right? Or the vulnerability scanning, or the tool that you are using, right? And the time that is allocated for it. So at this point, also, every finding will kick in the vulnerability remediation policy, right? So that means that developers will be under pressure to provide a fix in a short time frame. Okay. So what can we do better, right? Well, development and security need to work together. So what we need to do is to implement security in different phases of the development cycle. And why development needs to work with security, because developers know their product best. They know which kind of controls they need to implement in the product. And again, security must know coding, because if it doesn't, then they will never understand completely the development teams, right, and the product itself. So my advice is teach security to developers and development to security. And we see this switch happening also from the GitLab survey. We can see that while in 2022, security people that responded to the survey felt completely responsible about the security of the product, in 2023, we have only the 30% responded like that, right? Now we have the switch to, I'm responsible, but I'm part of a bigger team, right? The development team is also part of it. What is the pitfall number 2, right? So pitfall number 1, security is not embedded in the development cycle. To improve, we need to switch, our security thoughts to the left, right? That doesn't mean that we need to put all the tools, right, in one shot in our development cycle, because then we will fall into this mistake, right? And what I see in the past experience is that, and this is one of the biggest pitfalls, is that we try to add tools a security tool for everything, right? We try to add SAST, SCA, DAST, Secret Scanner, IAST, to name a few, Docker scanners, all at the same moment. But all these tools have different dashboard rules, speed, capabilities, right? And training the people on the capabilities of the tool and the output is not going to be easy, right? If we add multiple tools at once, at least I will go crazy if I was part of the development team. So, and the amount of issues that these tools will raise will be most probably put on the backlog, and they will just, rest them forever. So what can we do better? Well, we need to start small. So my recommendation is to start with SAST and SCA tools, so static analysis tools that will identify vulnerabilities in our own code, and SCA, so software composition analysis tools that will identify vulnerabilities in third-party component, in open source libraries, right? It will help you to create, right, the software bill of materials of your product. What third-party products are you using in your applications, right? And then expand once you have matured the process around the tools. So the question that you need to ask yourself when implementing the DevSecOps program, or you start embedding tools, right, in your development lifecycle, is: do you have a security policy defined to react on issues, right? What you see on the slide is that focus on critical and high that are exploitable, right? Don't try to fix all the issues at once, right? Second, define who is responsible to review the findings and how, right? That's very important. We saw in one of the frustration from the GitLab research that there is still a problem to identify who is responsible for mitigating vulnerabilities, right? If you define that in your policies, in your process, then it will be easier later. Who is responsible to approve false positive, for example? And one other recommendation is start generating a software bill of materials, because we will see this topic recurring in the next couple of years with more and more regulation, like the CRA, right, the Cyber Resilience Act. When implementing the DevSecOps, program in your company, my recommendation is to follow a maturity model. It's easy to start, grabbing a tool, putting it in the development cycle, and then start using it. But what really makes the difference is to have a reference, right? To do a gap assessment, where you stand at the moment and where you want to be. And in order to do that, there is a very good resource from OWASP, the DSOM, so OWASP DevSecOps maturity model. And it has 5 levels, like from basic to advanced. And what it does, besides telling you, which steps you need to take to implement correctly DevSecOps program, it will also allow you to stay compliant with other standards like the OWASP SAM or security certification like the ISO 27001. All right, pitfall number 3, no issue tracker integration. So now that we have, let's say, we managed to skip the previous pitfall, so we have the right number of tools that we've carefully selected based on our maturity. It's time to make these tools more and more development friendly, right? Because if we have these tools and nobody's looking at them, or only the security team is looking at them, it's not going to work. Your DevSecOps program will most probably fail. So what we want to do is we want to integrate the results from these tools into our bug tracker, right? And for example, what you see on screen, this is Jira, right? That is used by development teams to track their progress. And why do we want to do that? Because this will help development teams to treat security issues with the right priority and quickly assign them to the right team members, right? So what do we need to do here? Do we want to import all the findings? No, we want to only import the findings that break our policies, right? I said one thing to do first is to define a policy. What do you want to focus on, right? And how much time does the development team need to has to remediate those findings? So if we go back to the previous development flow, what does this mean? This means that at this point in time, when If we have exploitable high or critical issues, well, that's when we import them in Jira and we assign them to the right team. Okay, it's this is a very important step to take in order to facilitate the vulnerability mitigation on time and prevent that findings will pile up in the tool or in backlog, and nobody will have visibility about those. Right now, false positive. This is my favorite. So you start importing findings in the bug tracker, right? One of the issues that we might have is that we might import an enormous amount of issues, then maybe more than 50% of those issues will be false positive. So how can we reduce the false positive? False positive reduction is actually a very important step when you start selecting your tools, right? And especially when you start integrating your tools as part of your pipelines, okay, in your automation. So false positive are part of the process, okay? So, but how can we remove, or maybe better, minimize false positive? We will never get rid fully of false positive, but we can minimize them. Well, one way, the first thing to do is definitely scan only production code. What we see is that most of the time, when we start using security tools, the code that is submitted to the security tools includes test, debugging code, and that doesn't help with identifying security issues that really matters, right? The second thing is focus on high fidelity findings. So SaaS tools, SCA tools are improving, and they can give you an indication on which findings are highly it's likely to affect your product, right? Focus on high fidelity, high and critical findings first, and then move to medium and then low, right? One important step to have, before you integrate your tools in the pipelines and in your development cycle is to start with manual scans, right? If you've never done before a manual scan, start with a manual scan, identify the issues that are false positive and flag them as false positive. That's when you can automate your scanners. Otherwise, you will start dealing with a lot of noise. And, well, integrate automated scans as soon as there is no or most probably very little noise, okay? Fifth pitfall, one security pipeline. This is an issue that we often see in big enterprises that want to, control and offer one way of developing products, but it might strike back because defining one security pipeline for all the teams means that all the teams need to work in the same way with the same tools, right? And what are the problems here? Well, not all the teams have the same maturity, security maturity. We might have teams that have, a very high maturity in security. They had trainings in the past. They know how to deal with the security issues, but you might have teams that are just starting up, right? And having one security pipeline means that they're using the same tools. They're getting flooded with issues, and they need to adapt fast. Products have different release cycles. Okay, so having one pipeline with the same scanning times, and it doesn't really work, right? You want to give teams the flexibility to scan when it's really needed, right? Although you want to do it continuously. Products have different complexity, right? And this will impact the speed. Okay, so for a team, like the security pipeline that you define might be perfect, but for another team that has a huge application, huge product with multiple interconnected libraries and microservices, that might be very slow, right? You want to choose the right tools for them to scan fast and with high accuracy. Your code will be stored in repositories, right? Multiple repositories, for example, in GitHub or GitLab. And repo structures will need tool customization, right? You need to tweak the tools to tell where to find the right information, where to find the authentication module, where to find the libraries, right? And one important consideration here is that if you're using like tools like platforms like GitHub, Bitbucket, right, you will have a branching strategy defined, and you will, for example, include new code only at certain point in your production code. And this might differ per team, and this will impact a lot how the pipeline is defined, right? And the controls that you will define in that pipeline. So what do we need to do here? We need to find the best fit for our pipelines. And how do we do that? Well, we need to adopt a risk-based approach, right? So what does that mean? That means that we need to define security scanning and pipelines based on the risk of the project or the risk of the product. You don't need, for example, 5 security tools for a static web page that never changes, right? So choose your tool wisely, and because they are very different, they solve different issues. And consider speed, quality, and integrations, right? Secret scans for every change is great and fast, but for example, SAST scanning on every change is not ideal, right? You might have changes that do not need SAST scanning, so you're only slowing down the development team. What you can do is you can consider like merge request on protected branch scanning. That means that every time that new code is going to be merged in a branch that is, for example, the production branch, right? So that code will be delivered to production. In that moment, you want to scan. And again, scanning only new code or scanning always the full project? Well, that depends on your risk appetite and your speed that you want to have in your pipelines, right? Now, one pitfall that it's quite new and is almost always present is that there is always a missing Git security posture. Because so now if we, let's say, tackle all the previous pitfalls, we got our tools integrated with that, with false positive, we customized our pipelines, right? We define our beautiful pipelines for every project. So are we good to go? Well, we're still not done, because one of the biggest security failures, right, in the last couple of years, I think there were a lot of news. It was about supply chain security, right? Supply chain attacks are actually one of the most complex to identify, as the root of the attack lies in something that we do not control, right? And although this pitfall is in position 6, I would rather consider it as one of the first, right? Because the question here is, do you control who can change your code? Do you take the right security measure on your Git environment, on your, for example, GitHub environment, GitLab environment? Do you know who is changing your code and when, and if that change is allowed or not? So what I recommend in this case is to harden your version control and pipelines. Like, this is an online tool, open source tools actually, that gives you an overview, right, of what is your Git security posture. It tells you, hey, is your repo public while it should be private? Is your branch protection enabled? That means that can everybody push code to the production branch, or do you need somebody to approve that code first in order to go to production? Or do you require signed commits on protected branch so you can identify who committed that code at a certain point, right? Or is that user verified by your organization? And so on, right? So it tells you as well, you know, what was the day since the latest commit. You can see, right? You can gather all this information from your GitHub environment, for example. But or do you have high and critical open issues in your project that are still standing that you need to fix before you ship that code to production, right? And at the same time, we want to take control of our pipeline. Right? We don't want anyone, right, to be able to inject malicious code in our pipeline, because pipeline operate on the code that we store safely in our Git environment. And if we have a vulnerability in our pipeline, that means that, like in this case, an injection, right, especially here, it means that everybody that, you know, can open a pull request will be able to inject malicious code in the title of that pull request. Yeah. So injecting code means that it will be able to execute code on our runners, and our runners will have the full code that was taken from our Git platform. Like in this case, what we're doing is in this specific job, in this specific pipeline, is that we see that the title is pulled from the pull request title, that everybody can create a pull request with a certain title. And if we put a title like this, so double quote and then ls GitHub workspace, what we have is something like this, right? We are able to list the files that are used, or the files that are in my repositories, and we don't want that. Okay. So what are the best practices here? We want to use actions or runners instead of custom script. If I just go back real quick, we see that this is a very custom script, right, that we create because maybe we need flexibility, but instead we could have used GitHub action or a GitLab runner that is available already and that is already safe and secured against injection. To defend pipeline, right, we do not want to pass untrusted input like title, description, comments, for example, in our pipeline, because this can be controlled by an attacker. We want to scan also our pipeline code, our YAML code, for example, for security vulnerability. And here we can use like our SaaS tools. Most of the SaaS tools have this capability, or SCA tools to identify, for example, actions that have known vulnerabilities. We want to restrict permission for tokens because in our pipelines, right, we have a lot of automation. We need access to external systems. We need tokens. We need authentication tokens to interact with other services. That means restricting permission for this token will help us, have a least privilege access. So also if we have an issue or an injection in our pipeline, then an attacker might not be able to gather those tokens. And I would really recommend to use the OSSF scorecard. It's something similar to this, and it runs as part of your repo, and it will give you an idea of how secure is your repo if you have the right security control in place, right? So this is to say that we do not only want to protect the code and the code that we ship to production, but we also want to protect the environment where this code lives in. Okay. Now, pitfall number 7, security as mandatory approver for merge request. So one thing that makes developers slow down is the security review, right, of every merge request. And for who that is not familiar with merge requests, we open a merge request whenever we want to add new code to our existing code, right, that will be shipped to production. And usually, previously, the security department was responsible to review every single merge request. We are talking about hundreds of lines, 1,000 lines of code, right? Now, what I want to say is that security does not need to review any pull or merge request, right? And there are two reasons why. Security, first of all, will be overwhelmed by merge requests that most of the times do not have security risk, and this will put the release pressure on security, right? And security cannot focus on providing better services, right? But also developers will rely a lot on security to spot security issues because they do not feel responsible, to double, triple check the code for security issue because there will be somebody from the security department that will do the review. So how can we improve this? Again, I think I already mentioned this, but adopting a risk-based approach is the way, because what we want to do is to have, of course, the right security tools that fail the pipeline, so fail the release or fail the next step based on your policy. So we said, for example, your policy would be, I do not allow any exploitable, high, and critical in my code, right, in my product. Or you can add security to the merge request automatically when security knowledge is needed. This sounds easy, but it's quite complex, but in order to do that, you can adopt a model to identify security-sensitive changes. And one model could be, for example, for web application, the OWASP application security verification standard checklist. Or lately, you could use AI bots to automate this process. Of course, this is not 100% guarantee that it will identify your security sensitive changes, but it could be helpful for the developers. So how does this checklist, for example, look like? A risk model, this is the OWASP application security verification standard, could be something like this, right? If there is a change that is made to authentication modules that are identified in your product, then most probably you want security to review that merge request with the changes, right? If there are changes to the access control, to the cryptography, to the communication, if we added a new endpoint, right, you want to have a second opinion from the security department. But if none of the changes fall in one of these categories, then there is no need for security to review the merge request and the release can continue. Now, pitfall number 8, we do not do threat model. And well, this is one of my favorite tweets. But because when we hear threat model, when the development teams or they started implementing a DevOps cycle hear about threat models, well, we run away. And the problems or the reasons why is that maybe DevOps processes are too fast for threat models. Threat model is complex. We always need security to do threat model. This is maybe another reason. We will do it once and then we will forget about the threat model. We just be on a Confluence page, for example. And documentation is an old concept. Well, let me tell you, this is completely false, right? And of course, the old approach of doing threat model, hours of discussing does not work anymore with DevOps, with DevSecOps, because we need to be fast, right? But there is a way to do threat model in an effective way in DevSecOps. And what we want to do is to do threat models as part of our planning platform. Like adopt a model that, for example, will help you categorize and identify a set of threats. And here the security team can help. Do threat models in your planning tool, like Jira, ServiceNow, whatever tool you want. And again, AI maybe can help speed up the process. There are more and more tools or GPTs that can help identify or automate some of the steps of the threat model. I'm not saying that AI will solve the problem or will do the threat model for you, but AI can automate some of the steps, like identify some basic security threats that apply to a certain task. And why do I say do it in your planning tool? Because in the planning tool, you have everything you need. You have, for feature X, you have the epic that belongs to, you have the interconnection with other features that maybe have been already threat modeled and so on. And that's where the development teams work. So for feature X, for example, discuss quickly. It doesn't have to take hours. But in your sprint planning, for example, discuss what can go wrong, what are we going to do to remediate it, and how do we avoid it forever. But you might say, okay, but what do we look for in when we do a threat model? Well, it really depends on the type of application you're building or the product that you're building, but you can start from great resources like the OWASP Top 10, right? The OWASP Top 10 list that are the top 10 risks or vulnerabilities identified in the past 3 years, 4 years. If you're building a web application or microservices or server-side applications, right? But what you can also do, you can apply threat models to cloud. And a great resource is the Egregious 11 from Cloud Security Alliance. It's basically the OWASP Top 10 for cloud instances, right? For example, you want to avoid account hijacking, you want to avoid insecure interfaces and APIs, right? Exposing your S3 buckets somewhere online with all your sensitive data, or abuse of cloud services, for example, that you maybe don't need, or insider threat. and so on and so on. So adopt the right model based on what you're building, okay? Do not try to find a solution for everything. Now, pitfall number 9, I think, is the last one: compliance security trainings. So what I see a lot, especially in a big corporation, is that developers and dev teams, R&D teams, are trained on using the same trainings that are used for the whole enterprise. Or there is another problem is the developers that are using technologies like Python or programming languages like Python are trained in Java. And that's a big problem. So how do we fix it? Or another problem is that these trainings are only slides. There is no hands-on practical experience. Well, the way to fix this, and the way to empower your developer to handle more and more security tasks and become more and more security aware, especially when it comes to DevSecOps, where the release cycles are faster and faster, is my recommendation is to create a security champions program. That means identifying people interested in security inside the teams and empower them through hands-on trainings, right? So give them exercises, use gamification, and reward the teams, right? They will reward the people. And there might be any kind of reward, like from a day off, or more rights to handle security tools or findings, so they can increase the speed of developments as well. And organize company-wide capture the flag. So organize sessions where everybody gets together and gets to know, security issues, how to fix them, how to exploit them, why not, and how to use security tools to succeed. So what are the key takeaways from this presentation, Road to Success? Yeah. Well, the first key takeaway is to include security as part of the development process, and that I think it was pretty clear throughout the presentation. Start with 1 or 2 tools, focus on SAST and SCA, right? Tools are not the solution, but your processes. If you miss the process, you focus on your tools, you will most probably fail. Adopt a maturity model and stick to it. So select only one, that's the law, and do not add multiple maturity models, because that won't work. Integrate vulnerabilities in the developers tool. So Jira, Confluence, ServiceNow, whatever you selected. Developers are in charge of defining their pipelines, right? Do not force one security pipeline for everyone. Involve security only for iris change, right? Do not add security for every review. Security is there to help teams understand the issues, fix the issues, identify issues maybe in your complex issue, like business logic issues or architecture issues in your product. Do continuous thread model. Continuous thread model means doing 50-minute session, 30 minutes max. We don't want to have a thread model session of hours, right? Because they will not scale, it will become boring and will not help our cause. Improve your Git security posture. Don't forget to secure where your code is stored. And then last but not least, select custom hands-on training for security champions in order to empower them, to give them the right knowledge to do the job and be part of the security success in the DevSecOps cycle. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Davide.